Welcome to Ecology Matters, a podcast from the Ecological Society of Australia, featuring ecologists from all over the country.
The biodiversity in this part of the world is just incredible.
It's not just ice and snow, it's teeming with life on the coast.
I see that and I say, okay, well, that's a great opportunity to study it more.
Looking at those sites gives you a sense of joy and hope.
Love being a ranger. It's incredible.
It's just, it's a really awesome program, and it's just so healing, like, for our whole community.
It's the beauty of ecology is that it's so interconnected.
Yeah, it's been really exciting actually.
Professor John Woinarski has been involved in research, policy and management of Australian biodiversity for over 40 years. His career has intersected several fields, from fire and forestry to invasive species management. He's been awarded a Eureka Prize for biodiversity research, a Serventy Medal for lifetime contribution to Australian ornithology, and an Australian Natural History Medallion. He sat down with us during the 2023 ESA conference in Darwin to discuss the impacts of feral cats on wildlife.
I would really like to focus on your career looking at feral cats in Australia. You have worked on a broad range of ecological fields, but this one is particularly interesting to me because it's so pervasive across Australia. For anyone that doesn't know why cats and feral cats are a problem in Australia, could you just explain some of the major impacts on Australian wildlife?
Yeah, sure. One of the most outstanding conservation concerns in Australia, compared to any other continent, is the extent of loss of mammals, endemic mammal species in Australia. We've lost about 34 species since 1788, which is far more than, for example, continental North America, which only lost one species in that time. So something really strange and unsettling has happened to the Australian mammal fauna. And we can trace that down almost certainly to the introduction of cats and foxes for most of those 34 mammal species that are now extinct. So cats, particularly more so than foxes, have had a particularly devastating impact on the fauna. They've denuded the number of species, native mammal species, that occurred across almost all of Australia. That impact's continuing. So many species that are still existing are suffering because of the impacts of feral cats. But it's not the native mammals alone, it's a whole range of other bird, reptile and other species that are affected by cats. And cats are also bringing the impacts are not only through predation alone, but also through the introduction of diseases that would never have been in Australia and that would not be in Australia were it not for cats.
I do have some stats in front of me on the number of cats across Australia. There are between 1.4 million cats after drought and 5.6 million after wet periods, with the highest densities in arid and semi-arid areas. Why do they favour these particular areas and these particular environmental conditions? So
cats are really remarkably efficient, flexible species. They're really good design. They can sort of occur across all habitats, from sort of alpine areas to the harshest deserts. But the deserts obviously come alive. A whole range of species erupt and become really dense and numerous after good rainfall events. And cats, because they've got a really rapid reproductive rate, can capitalise very much on those numbers of prey species and increase to relatively, or to very high densities in Central Australia in those times. And we've been able to monitor that through, cats are nocturnal and a bit hard. They're a bit secretive as well, so it's quite hard getting good population density estimates for cats. But through a range of sort of camera array techniques that have developed over the last couple of years, we've got really good, precise density estimates for cats across a wide range of locations and environments in Australia. So we can then use that to model the dense population size across all of Australia, which is a remarkably useful tool. We can't do that for many other species, but for cats we do now have enough information.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because as you mentioned, we do know that cats have been in Australia since the first fleet arrived, and they spread across most of the continent very, very quickly. Why do you think it is that some of these quantitative studies, some of these studies really focusing on the impact of cats, are only coming out in the last couple of decades?
Yeah, look, people have known about the detrimental impacts of cats in Australia since sort of about 1900. There were a whole range of sort of early naturalists were worried about the extinction of birds and mammals at that time because of cats. But it hasn't been until relatively recently that people have actually figured that we should be doing something about it. And obviously we need the evidence base initially. That evidence base is in terms of the distribution and abundance of cats and their impacts on native fauna. So a whole range of concentrated, highly focused, targeted studies have occurred over the last decade or so, partly in recognition that this is an ongoing threat to Australian biodiversity. So partly it's because of the magnitude of the impact has become better recognised, and that then feeds more studies and more attempts to sort of get more evidence from which we can use to hone management responses.
And you talked there about some of the technologies that we're using to track cats and to assess their abundance as well. That would work in our favour in terms of being able to know appropriate management strategies.
Yeah, look, we know a hell of a lot more about cats in Australia than sort of almost any other place in the world, and we know much about their ecology and the way they feed, where the habitats they use and the like. But notwithstanding all that evidence, it's still proving a really difficult nut to crack to actually get landscape scale management of cats effectively done in Australia.
And that leads me to last year or the year before, there was a federal government report that came out which gave some recommendations on how to manage the impact of cats. And they included a couple of recommendations, including registering pet cats, spaying and neutering, and a nighttime curfew. What do you feel about those recommendations and whether they go far enough? And would you have others that you would add to that?
Yeah, there's a series of recommendations, both about pet cats and feral cats. I'll do the feral cat ones first, if that's okay. And there's a imminent threat abatement plan, a new iteration of that for feral cats in Australia, which sort of hones in particularly on the need to protect proactively those species, particularly mammal species, that are extremely susceptible to cat predation, that can't live anywhere in the landscape if there are cats. So that's sort of a focus. We can focus particularly on those species that would become imperiled or extinct were we to do nothing at the moment. So we also need to recognise that many other species are affected by cats as well. And they're a bit harder to deal with. For the most susceptible species, we can set up sort of havens, fenced exclosures and the like, in which we can reintroduce those threatened native mammal species and exclude cats and foxes. And that's proven really effective at conserving many of these species that would otherwise become extinct. So that's great. The broader landscape scale management of cats is more problematic, but there are tools that we can use to reduce the cat density in across relatively large areas, including better management of the land, including of fire and grazing pressure and the like. Pet cats is actually in many ways an easier and a harder nut to crack as well. And largely it's about changing human behaviour, which is probably easier than changing cat behaviour, but still has its problems. So part of the issue there is for pet cat owners to understand the potential impacts their pets are having. You know, in many cases you can have your pet cat, but your neighbours won't have wildlife, and you won't have wildlife in your yard as well. And some pet cat owners are reluctant to accept the evidence there. So one needs some sort of regulations and compliance as well. But also part of the argument is that, in fact, constraining your pet cat, keeping it inside at all times, is actually better for the cat. It lives a longer life, it lives a healthier life. And it doesn't go out. It's much less likely to contract disease that you as a pet cat owner yourself will contract. So pet cats or cats are the primary and only source of toxoplasmosis, for example, in Australia. Were it not for cats, there would be no toxo. And toxo has incredibly strange and serious consequences for humans. But also, the recent evidence suggests that toxoplasmosis has a whole range of psychiatric consequences, including increased incidence of schizophrenia, much more risky behaviour, particularly by men, increased gambling, a whole range of other sort of neurotic diseases. So keeping pet cats, if you want to keep a cat at all as a pet, then it's better for the cat, it's better for the wildlife, and it's better for you if that cat is constrained.
We're here at the ESA conference, and yesterday in your plenary, you were talking about the importance of emotion, or allowing emotion into our approach to some of our environmental challenges, allowing both hope and despair to influence our actions. When we talk about cats, feral cats particularly, the problem seems so pervasive. How do you let your emotions guide you towards this problem? You've been working in it for so long. How has that changed over time, and how do you let it influence your actions going forward?
Yeah, look, my first introduction to this problem or this challenge was through monitoring mammals in Kakadu National Park and other parts in northern Australia, where over the course of a decade of monitoring, sort of the population of native mammals crashed. And whereas I used to go and catch squillions of critters in the traps in the morning when I set them, and it was a delight, and sort of bandicoots were running around our fireplaces at night time, campfires at night time and the like. After 10 years or so, that those forests were empty almost of mammals, and trying to understand what was the cause of that, and committing to trying to do something to prevent it or to restore that fascinating mammal community, sort of driven much of my work. So it's a challenge. There aren't any simple solutions, but if you were to go to any of the exclosures that have been set up for those threatened mammal species and walk inside the fenced area where there are no cats or foxes, you can see a glimpse of Australia as it once was, with sort of thriving hare wallabies and bettongs and bandicoots running around in sort of really high numbers. They're really effective. They're not loser species. They're really effective at what they do. They're really important in the landscape, and they can be really successful if you remove the pressure placed by cats on them. So, looking at those sites gives you a sense of joy and hope that if we can solve the cats issue more broadly, then Australia can be restored and much of our fantastic native mammal fauna can come back. But in the meantime, we've got these insurance populations or places that are set up, small parts of the landscape which are set up where cats and foxes don't occur. And they're really important sort of education centres, really important to actually recognise that, yeah, sure, cats and foxes must have been the problem that caused the decline. And really important for people to glimpse that, what they're used to in the landscape, which is a land with very few mammals, is actually artificial consequence of the way we've damaged the environment, and that the real Australia lies within the fenced areas. We can get a glimpse of it there. But the other issue with emotion and this particular challenge of management of cats in Australia is that there is a groundswell of opposition to any control of cats. And it's particularly strong in North America, where sort of a whole range of cat control measures for conservation have been stymied or prevented either by law or otherwise, or by sort of activism from being implemented. And there's been conservation detriment because of that sort of emotional tug of preventing any sort of killing of cats. There's some of that in Australia, and there's some evidence also of sort of, or there's some activism around the use of poisons in the landscape, 1080 and like. And you can understand where that's coming from, but it's a case of the end justifying the means, I think, in this case. There's also an argument from compassionate conservation that we should not be killing anything in our wildlife management careers or jobs, or that cats are now part of the natural landscape and they should be let live. It's not the cat's fault that they were introduced to Australia, and therefore cats shouldn't take the blame and be killed. I can understand and sympathise with that argument, but it's just so counterproductive, and it comes at such terrible cost to Australian wildlife and sort of the land and legacy we leave to our descendants.
Ecology Matters is a podcast by the Ecological Society of Australia, a not-for-profit organisation supporting ecologists and ecological science in Australia. We acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. To learn more about our work, follow us on social media, visit our website or sign up to our newsletter. You can find links to these in the show notes. The theme music is Glow by Scott Buckley. Lastly, thank you to all the ecologists who have taken part in this series and shared their perspectives on why ecology matters.